Welcome back. We have our final panel with us. Before I introduce our next panelist, just a quick note to say we've had a lot of requests for this book. We've run out of the book, but the online version is available on our website for free, so please do feel free to look it up. Now for the last and the final panel to talk to us about creating a safer space for online dialogue and the balance between technology and society, could I please have on stage Aparna Krishnan, Mechanism Labs, David Bohl, University of Denver, Jahnavi Phalkey, Science Gallery Bengaluru, Shankar Maruwada, EkStep Foundation, and Saritha Rai, Bloomberg.
I've been told that being on the last panel in a conference such as this is not exactly the position to be in, but I have such an interesting panel here that I think you will find that that's not true today. Our topic for today's panel is Technology and Society, Creating a Safer World. Before we begin, I just want to read out some interesting recent news clips that illustrate what a staggeringly complex technology world we live in. AI will be in every industry and every job. Companies are still trying to figure out how to stop machine learning algorithms from discriminating at scale. Governments are struggling to determine how to regulate AI to curb dangerous and unethical use. A US-China Cold War could be brewing, and this will be a fight for technology supremacy. Genetically modified vegetables, fruits, and grain are already here, but gene-edited animals are coming, and some of us could be eating them. At an individual level, there's online trolling, harassment, identity theft, fake viral videos, and there's also Me Too on social media. All these are effects of universal access of technology and the reach of the internet. Before I start, I would just like to ask you by a show of hands, how many in this audience has actually pulled off a period of at least 1 week of going completely off digital tech in the last 1 year? I see just 3 hands up. That is, okay, 4. That's a pretty small number for an audience as large as this. But the more optimistic among us believe that the promise of technology to create opportunities and social good are immense. But are we prepared for the unintended consequences of tech innovation? To talk about this subject that's become more urgent than ever before, we have an interesting panel of speakers. To my right is Jahnavi Phalkey. Jahnavi is the founding director of the Science Gallery in Bangalore, part of an international network of university-based galleries in Dublin, London, Melbourne, Venice, etc. She's a documentary filmmaker and a historian of science and technology, formerly based at King's College, London. She's the author of Atomic State, Big Science in the 21st Century India. Also to my right is Shankar Maruwada, the co-founder and the chief executive officer of EkStep, a universal learning platform for young children. Shankar has traversed the whole spectrum from the private sector to the government to the social sector. He's been an entrepreneur, he's worked for Aadhaar, and is now at education non-profit EkStep. To my right, we have Aparna Krishnan, who is the co-founder of Mechanism Labs. She's a Thiel Fellow and works on consensus and cryptography research. She co-founded and was the head of education at blockchain at Berkeley. To my far left, David Bohl is a senior research associate at Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver. He works on developing and promoting long-term integrated forecasting methods in the analysis of human development issues. He's been involved in expanding the international futures forecasting system, focusing recently on bilateral trade patterns, migration, and the informal economy. Jahnavi, the first question to you. We've had the last few years of humongous digital access growth in India because of 2 things: the inexpensive proliferation of inexpensive smartphones and the speedy fall of data rates. So in a country like India, where digital literacy will precede, in some ways, reading, writing, and math, in a significant chunk of the population, how do you sensitize populations to become, more sort of aware of proper use of technology? And whose responsibility is it? Is it companies? Is it the government? For instance, I'm reading that in the US, Google is talking about teaching young children in schools how to stay safe online, but there's a great irony in that right there. So,
yeah. So as you rightly noted at the start, I'm a historian of science and technology by training. One of our readings in grad schools used to be an essay called Kranzberg's Laws of Technology. Melvin Kranzberg was a historian of technology, the founder of the department where I studied. And among his 6 laws, there's one which says technology is neither good, nor bad, nor neutral. And I think that's basically my starting point as a historian for looking at technology and how it finds its way into society. But of course, I mean, technology is not from outside of society. So technologies get created from social desires, social aspirations, social goals, political goals. So it's a combination of several sort of things converging into the making of technology itself, and then it finds a life anew in society, right? And so, in a sense, when you ask whose responsibility it is, I think it's a collective responsibility. It cannot be any longer placed only at the footsteps of the state, although the state needs to be re-educated in new technologies, and we see that necessity ever stronger than before, for example. And this has happened at various points in history. So it's not, when printing came along, for example, or with the advent of the radio, or with sound amplification. So just to use one example about from sound amplification. So for example, if you look at leadership, political leadership in the 1920s and 30s, you have pictures that are sort of analogous, right? I mean, you have Hitler standing in front of the mic and shouting out. You have Gandhi sitting in front of the mic and speaking. You have Stalin standing, and it's my favorite image, which I've evoked many a times, standing at a podium speaking, and you know, the body language is also very similar, and he has, I kid you not, he has a bottle of vodka next to him, and he sort of, in the middle of the speech, stops, takes a shot, continues, right? The point being that sound amplification made a certain kind of political leadership possible, a certain kind of politics possible. With new technology today in the social and political domain, or in our lives, it is making it is making a different kind of social and political life possible, right? And therefore, the responsibility of it is also collective in a sense, because far more than ever before, the state has been surpassed in terms of both access to, control over, but an understanding of that technology, right? Our political institutions aren't prepared. And I think the Aadhaar case is a very, very good learning example for all sorts of social political institutions in India. So to come back to your more precise questions, whose responsibility is it? I think it's a collective responsibility. And while regulatory frameworks are always assistive, it is at the end of the day our common sense or a collective understanding of what kind of society we want to become that determines what kind of debate we have on these issues, what kind of information we share with each other about these issues, and what kind of a society do we become. And I think that is where today our cultural institutions are falling short. Our cultural institutions lack an interface with technology, or with makers of technology, with the corporate world and technology, and the people on the other hand. And this bridge has to be, in fact, strengthened and built again in order for the quality of that debate to become better, and therefore for better sort of sensitization, a better cultural awareness of what it means to become a technological society anew. Because like with other technologies before, this hasn't been experienced before. So that would be my sort of shortish answer to your question.
Shankar, since Jahnavi brought up Aadhaar, there's a lot said about technology helping solve problems at scale in a country like India. I just wanted you to come in on that topic and give us sort of examples of how, not just what has happened so far, but what might be the possibilities of the future.
Right. So, firstly, let me share my thought on what I think technology is. I'm not a technologist, though I run an education foundation whose strength is technology. I believe technology at the simplest level is that which enhances human capabilities, that which enhances the capabilities of institutions. Jahnavi put it very well. It makes certain social and political life possible, certain economic life possible. So I can do some things without technology. Technology comes in, now I can do certain things, right? Whether that is cook a meal with fire, cut vegetables, fly in an aircraft, figure out where the Swiggy delivery guy is. All of these are now possible because of technology. And the thing about technology is some of these shift our equilibrium. We cannot imagine what it is like to go back to an era before the television remote was invented, right? Some of us cannot imagine reading paper on print, right? Equilibrium has shifted. So at population scale, some technologies allow this to happen across the length and breadth and diversity and the complexity of India. The mobile phone is one such device, right? And the history of the mobile phone started with the humble yellow PCO booth, right? And I want to add to what Jahnavi said, that the society desires something. And anecdotally, what I've heard is the cost of a mobile phone, the speaking time, you remember the days of 16 rupees per minute, right? The reason that dropped dramatically, among other reasons, causes, is politicians realized that a mobile is a very good way to very quickly gather a large crowd. So you can get a large crowd to a speech because SMSs, and so we had incoming free, right? We had SMS cost dropping. Now, somebody figured out, and then policy helped. But essentially, a tool like that, now most of us cannot imagine life without a mobile phone. That's a new equilibrium. If that happens at population scale, others take advantage of it. So, and in a country like India, where we have so many social problems, right? EkStep Foundation is working on solving one of them, early education, early learning. If you take the definition that technology can itself be good, bad, or neutral, neither good or bad or neutral. If you take the definition that it can enhance the capabilities of the teacher in teaching that particular topic on that day in a lonely village in a tribal belt, right, where somehow the government has connectivity, can that teacher look at the textbook, which has a QR code, use her phone, government teachers, most of them have smartphones nowadays, use that government phone and a government app to open up interactive digital content related to that day's topic, which tells her how to teach that topic better through a demonstration by India's best teacher, which tells her what kind of practice questions she should give the children. If it's English, how to pronounce that word correctly, whatever else. But she goes into class prepared to teach better. A child who cannot attend it, if their parents have a phone, can they use that to catch up on what the teacher talked about in class but she could not attend? These are all examples of human capability going up. Institutional capability. Can the government get a sense of the kind of learning that's happening, right? In each of this, there is good, bad, and neutral. The increase in capability. The problem with technology is, my belief, the best users of technology are those who would like to do harm or do bad things with technology. That's the nature of technology. And therefore, as a society, once something is about to reach population scale, the other element of technology for impact, which is policy, has to kick in. Policy has to regulate. Policy has to decide usage permissions. Policy has to kind of lay out what is good, what is bad. Let me give an example. Thermal imaging. Defense uses it. Law forces uses it. Imagine if it's sold in the market as like a binoculars, right? You and I are not going to be too happy about it. So it is not sold. So for each technology, the unintended consequence, we have to think through what could be the unintended consequence. Sometimes the change is so fast, you just cannot. Or the change is so dramatic and the options are so many, you cannot. And that's how we run into some of the problems. But technology will continue to grow faster than policy's ability to harness it or react to it. That's a reality. And we must figure out how to deal with that.
My next question is to Aparna. Aparna, you've specialized in blockchain technologies for many years. right from college. I wanted to ask you, could blockchain be the answer to decentralizing everything? And then what would happen to the nation state? Are there boundaries? I just wanted to, you to weigh in on that question from a very non-technical point of view.
Okay, cool. So first, I want to talk a little bit about how, like a great point that you mentioned, which is policy cannot keep up with the technology that we're creating. So from that perspective, maybe what we really need is technology to govern technology. And the way I view blockchain is as a technology that creates this sort of balancing act between tracking software and privacy. So when people say blockchain is going to solve all of your problems, I promise you it's not. If you have to have a blockchain, if you have to have a decentralized everything, that's one, impossible, two, terrible from a user experience. How many of you would be willing to recompile or like reboot your system, every single part of your system, just to use and have privacy? If I told you you have to restart your phone, restart every single app, and restart like every single transaction that you're doing in order for you to have complete privacy, would you care enough to do that? Probably not. And that's where I think complete decentralization is a myth. But I do think that decentralization is very powerful. For example, it gives people back access to privacy. How many of you are comfortable with the idea of a government or an organization knowing exactly where you are every single minute of the day, exactly what you're doing, what you're eating, where you're sleeping, your sleep cycles, your eating schedules? How many of you are comfortable with all of that information in the hand of one organization? Show of hands. Seems like no one. Okay. Looks like we have a couple people. But I think what we've created with AI and machine learning is awesome, and it's enabled us to do a lot of great things. But at the same time, it's taken back a lot of the privacy that we had. So for example, China has a credit scoring, a social scoring system where people aren't friends with other people because they're afraid that their social score is going to go down if they're associated with someone who has a bad score. Now, that has essentially taken humanity out from humanity because we created technology to such an extreme extent. And I think blockchain is going to exist or coexist with AI and give you back freedom and privacy that you desire, while at the same time providing you all of this other convenient technology that you've built. Yeah.
David, you specialize in international futures forecasting, and I just want to ask you, what are the potential negative implications of technology beyond labor, particularly in developing countries? And you've worked quite a bit in Africa and South America. You know, if you can talk a little bit about that, maybe even include labor if you want.
Well, over the past few days, I think we've heard a lot about the benefits that can accrue to companies or to countries with the adoption of new technologies. We touched a little bit on some of the risks associated with it. Yesterday, I think there was a question that asked to try to contextualize the impact that artificial intelligence and automation might have on the Indian economy in particular. He kind of further provided some additional context by saying, in India, I believe roughly 80% of the labor force is employed in the informal sector. So the answer that I heard was largely this is an economic question and not one of artificial intelligence. And for the most part, I certainly agree. That is the domain of that question. But I don't think that the solution is going to come from there. And to steal from another quote, I think that the problem is too important to be left up to the economists. This is a problem that's going to manifest itself in a variety of different ways. involve a variety of different actors, and the solution is going to come from a similar mix of actors and stakeholders. If I had to speculate on how that would happen, my immediate reaction would be that the benefits that accrue to India through these new emerging technologies are not going to be distributed equally, and that's largely because of the unique context of the labor force just being one of many characteristics. That said, technology can also offer a number of solutions to help bridge that divide. And one of the ones that I just recently learned of was the national ID. One of the problems with informality is that it lives in the shadows, right? It by definition doesn't want to be seen, right? In some countries, the informal economy is there because they're trying to avoid regulation or overburden some taxes. In other countries, it's largely a survivalist situation. But either way, these groups oftentimes don't receive the same benefits, aren't able to save, or any savings that they do have might be wiped out with any sort of health-related event. This digital ID provides kind of a bridge so that people can begin to receive some benefits, right? They can receive welfare or something like that that will allow them, again, to start to reinvest into their own futures. And it starts to close that gap between the formal and informal sectors. It starts to maybe redistribute the gains that could be received from some of these new technologies, right? So I know we're talking about risks, but that was one of the risks. It was kind of a double. All of these are going to be kind of, two-sided arguments, right? Another one that I've just been thinking about recently, and my background, as the introduction suggested, is not in technology by any means. So this has been a really eye-opening event. I'm beginning to see how perhaps a lot of our models are missing something, particularly when it comes to the technologies that are on the horizon. Another potential risk that I think might be associated with this is the ability for new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and automation, to disrupt the traditional way that countries have developed, right? We've got kind of this very simplistic idea of countries start off as largely agrarian, low-level manufacturing, low-skilled manufacturing comes in, so as agricultural production becomes more productive, it frees up labor, it's able to move on. This is kind of a stepwise process that eventually leads to a country becoming a high-income country, right? If, as some people are suggesting, automation and artificial intelligence could lead to a kind of reshoring of economic production where countries, instead of relying on trade and other countries to provide some of the more labor-intensive economic facets, they produce that in-house, that begins to erode some of the advantages that countries have seen in terms of their comparative advantage. This process allowed for a slow transition and a slower accumulation of skills. If you begin to remove that, essentially what you're doing is pulling the rug out, or perhaps removing some really crucial stepping stones that countries have. And I don't think our models, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, are economic models. And I'm not talking about necessarily quantitative models here, but the way that we think about this, the way that policymakers are informed about how to make decisions. I'm not sure that we're considering that at this point, and that's something that we really need to be prepared for. Yeah.
I think that's interesting, David, particularly because I think governments are still sort of talking in language that equates economic progress with jobs, traditional jobs, and so we have slogans such as "Make in India" or "Make America Great Again," kind of coming in from that point of view, bringing in jobs, bringing in traditional jobs, and that's no longer going to be the way things are going to evolve, and that's really interesting. And I have, Jahnavi, I have a question about, considering your background in education. I wanted to ask you, technology is addictive, and you know, companies are in the business of sort of hooking people and keeping them hooked. So is there any sort of effort amongst people in education to find a way to teach ourselves to be de-addicted from technology, and does that involve sort of redesigning digital literacy itself?
So a few years ago, I started on, and did not take to logical conclusion, a project on technological solutions to mass education. What we were trying to do in the project was to trace the transition from satellite-based mass education to the internet-based mass education using primarily technology, right? So some of you will remember, and I will completely betray my age by revealing, you know, UGC countrywide classroom, for example, on Doordarshan, and other programs that followed at that point of time. So the thing is that, I mean, one, it's not just it's not just producers of technology, but also the state that has been heavily invested in using technology as a solution to mass education, because like for every problem in India, the problem is, the primary problem is one of scale, right? And therefore, and I guess your project is one in, you know, logically kind of follows from that trajectory. And the one observation from the one publication that we did write, having looked at everything from, as I said, UGC countrywide classroom to Akash, which was the tablet which followed, in fact, on Simputer, which, you know, happy to see Chandru in the room, is that the device itself became the desire, right? So education in the use of technology itself became a goal, to the point where content was not as much a focus, not as much given attention to, and I'm glad to see that some of that is now happening with EkStep, from what I hear from you. And so in a sense, it's, so to come back to the point I was making, which is that it's not just producers of technology, but also the state that has been hugely invested in making people technologically literate, in a sense, right? So it is again, like, you know, the larger investment in what you want your citizens to become capable of. I mean, if at the dawn of you know, the IT revolution, or when internet kind of took over our lives, we were hugely optimistic about it all, right? We all thought, you know, democracy was at our doorstep, decentralized access to information was at our doorsteps, etc. So what we saw was a huge potential, about which we are becoming more and more cautious now. And therefore, we want to kind of distance ourselves from it. And we want, like that was a collective decision, we want this also to become a collective decision. But not everybody is going to follow. I mean, Sherry Turkle at MIT has been doing some interesting work around this, where, you know, where she talks about how people being sort of constantly on and you know, sort of not, and plugged into, and, you know, I have friends and colleagues who accuse me of it as well, occasionally. But the thing is, it is a difficult task to now expect, just because some of us have become alert to the problems of it, that the rest of because people are not at the same place on the curve, right? So just to give you another example from, you know, one of my, in fact, one of my favorite ones, from when the telephone was first launched in the United States. It was meant to provide information to homes, which range from everything from weather to marketing, right? So sort of telemarketing, effectively, the very first form of telemarketing, and weather information and this and that, and, you know, those kinds of things. And everybody in a few years was completely both surprised by the unintended consequences, as you've already talked about, that women took to the telephone like nothing, and they were calling each other up and exchanging all sorts of information that was not about weather and not about buying products. So it's, in a sense, technology has become something else in the hands of people, and I don't know that we've reached that point where these addictions have, in a sense, found full form. I mean, we are seeing we are seeing symptoms of certain things, and we are trying to find answers to those symptoms because they disrupt lives as we know it. But I don't think we've seen the full realization of where the current sort of crop of technologies can, in a sense, take us. And so I think, you know, in a sense, like I said, I mean, you know, regulatory frameworks do some amount of work for some things. They are never the benchmark for actual social political behavior. I mean, people do strange things. And people actually sometimes rebel and do other things, right? So that's the thing. So I think we still need to, not need to, but we might have to still wait and see, where this new crop of technologies, in a sense, takes us, what its various manifestations will be, and I'm, as a historian, sort of, the one, as a historian of science and tech, my one sort of, there's a part of me that says, okay, let's watch, let's wait and watch, let's not kind of impose immediate solutions or not even solutions, immediate sort of both diagnosis, but also sort of compulsory behaviors upon people, but rather actually allow things to manifest, and they may not necessarily go bad. I mean, we do see people trying to detox, for example, right? I mean, all those wonderful words that have, that we see around us now. Or we do see parents kind of, paying their kids to have time off their iPads and things like that. So I suspect, like, the word you used, equilibrium, right? I mean, we might find a balance somewhere or the other. So I'm not a big one for, heavy regulation. I do certainly believe that, like I said earlier, the state needs to be educated. We need to have better social debate on these questions. We need to exchange ideas with people who know about technologies and at the same time with people who are using those technologies. So I think that needs to happen, and the quality of that only needs to go up. But sort of a slightly lighter hand on holding back people.
That's so interesting because, reading about Steve Jobs unveiling the iPad, and very soon after in an interview, he said that he wasn't allowing his daughter to use the iPad. It's this completely new, absolutely shiny device that everybody wanted to get their hands on. And here was the creator of the device telling the world that he wasn't allowing his daughter to access the device. It was so interesting. But Jahnavi, the thing in India is that some millions, hundreds of millions actually in India are going from not seeing the evolution in quite the way the Western world has seen it. For instance, people may not even have encountered the printing press or the telegraph or the mobile phone, or the landline phone or even a computer, and they've gone from there straight to the smartphone era. And that's, that's something that sort of brings a lot of the questions of, the unintended consequences of, addictive use of technology.
Yeah.
Shankar, I wanted to ask you, now, technology is, sort of racing ahead and developing much faster than institutions and, and do you foresee a time where the gap makes society sort of not so stable?
Possible. Because as this Google chief economist drew, the pace at which technology is growing is like this. The pace at which we can change is like this. So this gap will only grow. But to go back, it's no different from when the printing press was invented. You could not go back to a world without printing press, right? We have to find out ways of surviving it. I'm sure there were similar debates when the first nuclear bomb was exploded, right? Now somebody with one button can destroy the whole planet, right? So I'm optimistic in the ability of society to figure out ways, but this gap will only increase. And I echo what Jahnavi said, that we can't put a muzzle on it. Technology will find a way, right? It will escape all kinds of shackling. Sorry? People will find a way. That's the important point, because it's not technology finding a way. It's people are finding a way. They want to improve what they can do for good, bad, neutral. Technology allows them to do it. One of the things is, going forward, one person, one group can do a lot of good or bad with technology. That's a fact. We have to understand and live with it. So what if technology or policy and the way we react to society, as a society, instead of being paralyzed by technology, we can take advantage of the same, right? One of the things with policymakers is what I call as a fire and forget. You launch a scheme, you don't know what happens to it until it's too late because you'll get the data after 4 years, 5 years, right? What if relevant data is available in real time? Then you have real time control loops kicking in like you have with an aircraft, right? Then you don't need to worry about getting things perfect on day one. You can start off gently, gingerly. So like in the example I gave of this app, which by the way is happening in 5 to 7 states of India. It's a Government of India app. They just use free technology which EkStep is one of the organizations that has created. It allows anyone to access that content. So some of you would have used Paytm to pay. Here teachers and children are using it to access content. By design, there is no login. By design, the government has ensured that they do not collect data on individuals, right? If they want to, for certain cases, they can always decide later. So if technology can do 10 things, being a bit cautious about it and not unveil all its benefits in one grand go, not knowing who will take advantage of it, might be a coping mechanism, right? Like I give the example of thermal devices, right? It allows you to see behind walls, which serves a purpose. But in excitement, if you want to create a thermal imaging market, right, you know instinctively that's not right. But in the future, we may not know instinctively, right? We might have to create some mechanisms to help us think through what could be the unintended consequences. But technology will find a way. She would know better, but that's been the story of technology.
Aparna, the techie on the panel, do you think algorithms can be made accountable to humans, and at the point where they are so sophisticated, can humans sort of grab controls back?
That's a really interesting question. One, because humans are the creators of these algorithms. And if we create algorithms that are accountable to humans, they would be. So this is another like interesting discussion I've had with one of my roommates, which is like, well, should, like around AI ethics, should each inanimate object have self-control? Can you like implant AI in this water bottle or something like that? And I think while there would be some people who try to create algorithms that could be accountable, there are still other people who, for sake of reputation, for the sake of, well, someone's going to want to create technology because it's cool. And you can't stop that person from creating it. It's going to get created and it's going to get put out there, whether or not you like it. And maybe most people are creating technology that's going to have accountability, but someone is going to create technology that is going to not. And is there a way to counter that? Maybe, maybe not, but that's something in the future to think about.
Saritha, if I can jump in. Sure. There's this US professor was telling us that the next generation of algorithms will write code themselves. So you don't need humans to write code because the algorithms will write. So as they're thinking about the future, one of the questions they're asking is, how do you train an algorithm in manners? How do you teach gender sensitivity to an algorithm? Yes. It's a very important question, right? So then I asked, so is it like you are educating a child, you're inculcating values in a child, right? Is that what you have to do with an algorithm? He said, yeah, maybe, right? But we don't know. But if we can figure out what works, you have this powerful entity, right? That doesn't know its own power. That will do what it's trained to do, right? Can we, then the role of humans being to, so here's a, not wish, but the optimistic view I have. Maybe technology will end up in teaching us to be better human beings. Because everything else the technology will do, right? Can we use technology to say, what is it really about being human that a computer cannot do? A computer cannot be human in the way we treat other human beings, right? So ironically, while technology might take away all our jobs, it might teach us what it really means to be human, what it means to admire poetry, what it means to put a smile on somebody's face. These are not things that technology can do now, right? So I have hope in that sense.
Actually, could I continue on with that as
Sure,
well?
absolutely.
This was, and again, I apologize if this is AI 101, not a techie. But in the AI conference yesterday, there was a brief discussion about ethics and how do we train them to be, well, how do we construct the training so that it's the most ethical that it can be? And the takeaway that I had was essentially try to reduce any bias that you have in the training data set. One of the things that was striking me and what kind of you just made me think of was the fact that the data that we're measuring, the data that we're using, even if we have a population-wise data set that contains every single data point that would be possible, that data itself was constructed by the social systems that we have.
Yeah.
It's going to inherit the same sort of biases, issues. So perhaps the first step in AI training us to be better is the fact that if we're constructing AI, what we might be doing is kind of constructing a bit of a mirror.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe AI is showing us a mirror.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Could I just add to that? In a sense, as a historian, it's a little bit reassuring to hear that somehow people in AI think that the human past is worth learning from. But I think this is, apart from the joke, I think there's still something quite serious to be considered in that, is that, we've learned, we know a lot of the human past is a mess. And if it's patterns from this mess that we want machine learning, to take the direction of, data points are not neutral, and therefore, what is the outcome of this going to be? And then what is the place of, as several, people working in AI itself have asked, what is the place of mistakes? How does that even happen? But I'm with you, Aparna, when you say that, technology is cool and therefore someone's going to do it. This was the question that was asked of Edward Teller when he was working on the H bomb after the use of the atomic bomb. And when he was asked, why did you do it when you knew about the destructive capability of something like this? And he said, well, the problem was sweet, right? And I think that's the, that's sort of, so it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and that's why sort of my reluctance to say, okay, regulatory frameworks are going to actually do something, or that we might actually, muzzle is a word I wouldn't have used, but still I think it serves the purpose. And a lot of it is waiting and watching and still intervening, as we were saying, as if our intervention or our opinions are not only going to matter, but that they might actually, in slow and small ways, transform the direction in which all of this is headed.
David, a last question for you before we throw it open to the audience. I know that there's been a panel here on gene editing and CRISPR as a technology, and much more than before, it sort of leads us to question who we are as human beings. And I wondered, quite in the same way as we have globe-wide policies on, for instance, air traffic or even shipping, how do you sort of see this as an area where countries like China and the United States are sort of racing to get ahead, and yet there is a need, a very urgent need for globe-wide cooperation in the field of technology?
Maybe just so I can tie that bit to where the conversation was before, let's kind of take that back. What we're getting at is an understanding that there are going to be unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences are intrinsically difficult to predict, right? We should probably be frank that we can't predict them. I think Manish said yesterday that the future is fundamentally unknowable, right? And that hurts because that's what I work in, forecasting. But it's true, right? It's true to some extent. Now that's not to say that we can't engage with, construct models around how things could unfold. It helps us to try to grapple with some of this complexity. typically, if they're large enough, you're going to see some level of social unrest, right? You can't take away one of our core elements of sustenance. So in the case of many Middle Eastern and North African countries, this food insecurity problem was coupled with